In the Siege of Mecca, Wall Street Journal correspondent Yaroslav Trofimov looks at an uprising at the holy shrine that helped give rise to Al Qaeda. His talk from the New School in New York City is an hour.
I would like to start by just telling the story of what actually happened in Mecca in 1979, because it's a story that has been obscured and is not really known to the wide public, in part because the Saudi government has made every effort to hide it from the public eye. The events that I describe in this book really started on in the morning of November 20th, 1979, which was a very special date in the calendar of Islam. This was the first day of the first month of the year 1400, really the beginning of a new century of Islam. During the dawn prayer in the Grand Mosque, which is an enormous stadium-sized enclosure that at the time contained about 100,000 worshippers, several hundred gunmen, led by a former Saudi National Guard corporal, stormed into the Grand Mosque with weapons and blocked all the gates, pushed aside the imam who was reciting the prayers, and took over this holy site, which is really the holiest site in all of Islam, according to the Muslim canon. The Grand Mosque is towards sort of the Kaaba, which is the center of the enclosure of the Grand Mosque, is the place towards which all Muslims must turn in prayer 5 times a day if they're Sunni, or 3 times a day if they're Shiite. And when they're buried, they have to be facing the Grand Mosque, the Kaaba in Mecca. And really, this is sort of the center of the universe around which the whole universe revolves. And a prayer in the Grand Mosque is worth 10,000 prayers elsewhere. Well, precisely because of this last belief, many people at the time used to bring coffins into the Grand Mosque, bring the deceased relatives, hoping to bestow on them the blessings that would be 1,000 times more potent than if they had been living elsewhere. And the rebels who stormed the Grand Mosque used this belief. They smuggled some of their ammunition and weaponry in coffins into the Grand Mosque. They also used the fact that the Bin Laden family, the Bin Laden company, the company that had been founded by Osama bin Laden's father and at the time was run by his brother, was still doing some work at the mosque. Much of the modern structure of the Grand Mosque had been built by the Bin Laden company. And so they drove 3 truckloads of ammunition and supplies into the basement of the mosque using an opening that was maintained by the Bin Laden company. And with the connivance of the Bin Laden company employees, they managed to stockpile enough for this takeover of this holy site. With all these worshippers trapped inside, the rebels gave their big declaration and announced what they wanted. And what they really wanted was a global conflict with the infidels. They had this apocalyptic vision. They believed that one of them is a Muslim Mahdi, sort of a messiah who would bring in redemption and the end of days. But they also had very clear political grievances. They objected to the presence of Westerners in Saudi Arabia. They objected to the fact that the royal family the portraits of the royal family were displayed on the walls in defiance of the Islamic prohibition on depicting living beings. And they really felt that the Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Muslim world had strayed from the path of pure Islam and they wanted to return to it. The group that took over the mosque was really the first union of jihadis from all over the world. This is the first time that radicals from Saudi Arabia came together with Egyptian Islamic militants, with people from Sudan, from Iraq, and even a handful of African-American converts who at the time had been studying in Saudi Arabia and were brainwashed by the campaign and by this movement. So once the mosque was taken over, all the gates were bolted, and the worshippers inside were made to pledge allegiance to the new Mahdi, to the new Messiah. And the leaders of the uprising, including Juhayman al-Utaybi, the chief rebel, were well trained in warfare, and many of them were senior ranking officers in the Saudi National Guard. And so they had a very detailed plan of defending the mosque against what they expected to be an onslaught of Saudi forces. They transformed the 7 minarets, these very tall towers, that really provide a bird's eye view of the rest of the city of Mecca, into sniper nests, really keeping the entire surroundings in the field of fire. And they blocked the main gates, and at the first attempt by the Saudi police to investigate and to enter the mosque, they opened fire and inflicted quite heavy casualties on the Saudi forces. Now, many of the people who were in the mosque at the time were not even Arabs. They were from Indonesia, from India, from Africa. They didn't speak Arabic. They didn't understand what was going on. And in this commotion, they tried to rush to the gates, tried to escape, and just to be met at gunpoint by the rebels who would not let them out for a while. The prayer, the sermon that the rebels had delivered was broadcast to the entire city through very powerful loudspeakers that were installed atop the mosque. So much of central Mecca heard the message, and there was a lot of confusion among the troops and among the ordinary Meccans, who felt, well, maybe it's true, maybe the signs of the Messiah have been fulfilled, because the man that they put forward as the Mahdi actually fit the bill of many of the prophecies that are contained in the hadith, the narrations of Prophet Muhammad's sayings and doings. His name was Muhammad Abdullah. He had a birthmark on his cheek. His facial features sort of matched the description in the hadith. And many Saudi troops that were rallying to the scene refused to fight. They were confused. Is it true? Is really the end of days coming? And obviously, they were aware of the prohibition on using weapons in this sacred precinct. According to the Muslim tradition, not even a bird can be killed, let alone a person, in the Grand Mosque. And so, at that moment, the Saudi forces, the Saudi government, really had a dilemma. They needed a religious backing for the attack on the mosque from the ulama, the clerical establishment, the leading Islamic scholars of Saudi Arabia. And these leading ulama knew very well who Juhayman al-Rutabi was, the leader of the uprising, because he had been very active in previous years in the missionary outreach movement that was sponsored by the Islamic University in Medina and by the leading clerics such as Sheikh Abdulaziz bin Baz, who would later become the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, in sort of going to the countryside and trying to preach and campaign for a return to the morals and the behavior of the most ultra-Orthodox, strictest form of Islam. And in fact, many of the future rebels were arrested a year before the attack on the Grand Mosque on suspicion of plotting something against the state, and were released because the religious establishment intervened and asked the royal family to let them go, much to their later regret, as Crown Prince Fahd would later say. In this hour of need, the royal family had to turn to the same clerics again, the same clerics who told them a year ago that the future rebels are harmless. And there the real historical bargain was struck, because much of the ideology that was espoused by the rebels was really shared by the religious establishment. They were just as opposed as the rebels to the fact that alcohol was more or less available in the kingdom at the time, that women announcers were present on Saudi television. And so in exchange for giving their approval to storm the mosque and to kill the rebels eventually, they extracted a promise by the royal family to really reverse much of the modernization that had happened in the kingdom up until that time. And so within weeks of the siege in Mecca, the women were taken off television, laws against alcohol started being enforced much more thoroughly, and most importantly, vast amounts of Saudi Arabia's oil revenues started to flow into this network of schools and madrasas and charities that the Wahhabi establishment set up all over the world, from Indonesia to Africa to the Balkans, really breeding this new generation of radicals who would later become recruits for Al Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. So having secured the agreement of the ulama, the Saudi government dispatched its forces towards the mosque. It dispatched armored personnel, carriers, and artillery. But at the same time, the royal family was not sure whether it's just an isolated event in the Grand Mosque or whether it's part of an uprising that would be spreading throughout the kingdom. So the first thing they did was to cut off the phone links between Saudi Arabia and the rest of the world. So for 24 hours, nobody knew outside of Saudi Arabia what was actually going on. And this blackout, ironically, was broken in Washington by the State Department, which dropped this bombshell announcing at a briefing that a disturbance of some kind has occurred in the Grand Mosque. Now, this was a very particular time in international history. This was November 1979, the month when the American embassy in Tehran had been overrun by Ayatollah Khomeini's supporters. American diplomats had been taken hostage, and so all attention in Washington at the time obviously was focused on Iran. And the working assumption in Washington in those hours became that the Iranians must be somehow involved in the Grand Mosque attack. There was very little information from the field. The CIA reporting at the time was complaining that, well, we don't know what's going on in the Grand Mosque because Muslims are not allowed into the Grand Mosque and into Mecca. Non-Muslims are not allowed into Mecca, and the CIA at the time didn't have Muslim agents that could dispatch and check on the ground what is actually occurring. And so in this sort of chain of tragic errors, the news that came out of Washington implicated the Iranians, pointing the finger at Ayatollah Khomeini. Well, the Iranians were not amused. The next morning, Ayatollah Khomeini's office struck back with a counter-accusation pointing the finger at the US, saying, well, no, it's not us. It's an American and Zionist conspiracy to take over the holiest shrine of Islam and to defile it. And it seems laughable to us, but it was believed throughout the Muslim world. Within hours, massive crowd amassed at the American embassy in Islamabad in Pakistan, storming the embassy, burning the building, killing Americans who were in it. Luckily, most of the diplomatic staff managed to survive because they were locked up in a special safe room, which was basically like a vault inside the embassy. And as the fire raged outside, they managed to hold out just long enough for the darkness to descend so they could leave the building. American embassies were attacked across the Muslim world in those hours, in Bangladesh, in Libya, in Turkey. And in Turkey itself, a young man by the name of Mehmet Ali Agca escaped from jail in those hours and penned a handwritten note to a Turkish newspaper where he said, I will avenge this American Zionist conspiracy by killing the Pope, which he tried to do the next year, shooting the Pope in Rome. So really, this event produced global reverberations. And it was really missed by policymakers at the time, which is the tragedy, sort of with the benefit of hindsight, is that nobody really realized that this is not a one-off, not a sort of a fluke occurrence, but really the beginning of what will become Al Qaeda, the first manifestation of global jihad. Well, going back to what actually happened in Mecca, once the army was summoned and once the National Guard was summoned to the Grand Mosque, they devised a plan of attacking the shrine, and Prince Naif, who at the time and now was the Minister of the Interior, and Prince Sultan, who at the time was the Minister of Defense and is still in that position today, really were quite reckless with human lives. Prince Naif famously said that, I don't care how many people will be killed storming the mosque, they will all be martyrs ending up in paradise. Everybody will envy their sort. So they initially sent wave after wave of soldiers to sure death, because the Grand Mosque itself was quite an impregnable fort. And they had to use artillery eventually to destroy a large part of the structure and to roll armored personnel carriers into the so-called Marwa Safa gallery, a gallery that unites the two holy hills of Marwa and Safa on the side of the mosque. After a long battle on the surface of the structure, the rebels withdrew into the underground. The underground, known otherwise as the Kabu, is a network of about 1,000 catacombs and rooms, an ancient labyrinth, and nobody really possessed at the time a map of it. And it was an ideal hiding out place for the rebels. The Saudi forces were unable to evict them. The Saudi government initially thought of asking for help from the American government, but Prince Turki, who was at the time the head of intelligence in Saudi Arabia and would remain in that position until 2001, at the time had a very low opinion of the CIA. The CIA had been decimated by the congressional hearings and the oversight in the early 70s, in the mid-70s, and really lost its ability to help on the ground in Saudi Arabia. In fact, looking at the CIA reporting from Saudi Arabia at the time, one sees just how little they knew about what's going on. Instead, the Saudis had turned in previous years to an alliance with the French. They formed a so-called Safari Club with the French intelligence and the intelligence agencies of Egypt and Morocco. The French intelligence agency at the time was headed by a very interesting person, Count Alexandre de Marange, who was himself half American. His mother was an American socialite. and who was a very determined Cold Warrior who held the Carter administration in very low esteem. He publicly described Carter as a baby-faced Boy Scout at the time. And he was more than eager to help and to send his men to Saudi Arabia to help Al Saud. They sent a very small contingent of just 3 troopers from the so-called Groupe d'Intervention de la Gendarmerie Nationale, which is the elite commander group of the French gendarmes, and at the time was probably the best special force in Europe, if not the entire world. So this commander group was led by a French captain by the name of Paul Baril. And when they came to Saudi Arabia, they brought with them a plane load of poison gas. And the chemical that they used, a pure powder CB, it was called, is very similar to the chemical that was used a few years back in the Moscow theater siege by the Russian special forces, which led to quite numerous casualties. So the French devised a plan. They devised a plan to perforate the ceiling of this underground and to pump this poison gas simultaneously throughout the underground, which was done. 2 weeks into the siege, the Saudi forces finally managed to retake the Grand Mosque and take the rebels either dead or alive, extract them from the underground. The rebels were then taken to the 2 hotels where the senior princes were lodged and filmed for the nightly news on television. The victory finally was proclaimed. And then another historical event occurred. 2 weeks after that, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, all these rebels, all the people who supported this ideology became very valuable allies that the Saudi government and the Egyptian government and others thought they could send to Afghanistan to help fight the godless communists. And so while the actual rebels who were in the mosque were executed, many of their supporters later ended up in Afghanistan and sort of joining the direct connection to Al Qaeda. The young Osama bin Laden himself was very much influenced by these events. He was living at the time in Jeddah, which is about an hour's driving from Mecca. And he later said that his loyalty to the House of Saud really began to fracture once he witnessed what he described as the defilement of the Grand Mosque by the troops loyal to the royal family. In later years, the ideology of Juhayman al-Utaybi, the leader of the uprising, was taken up by another man by the name of Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who was really the guru of the new generation of Al Qaeda. He was the cellmate and the teacher of the man who founded Al Qaeda in Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And sort of on a personal note, I spent quite some time in Iraq. So when I was staying in the Palestine hotel in Baghdad, the hotel was bombed by a suicide bomber that tried to ram into our hotel. Well, that suicide bomber was probably a young Saudi man, and he chose as his nom de guerre, as his nickname, the name Juhayman, which was sort of a sign of praise for the mentor, for the man who led the uprising in Mecca. I just want to talk a little bit more also about just the whole process of digging up this story, because it's really a taboo subject in Saudi Arabia. For the Saudi royal family, they claim to legitimacy. Their very standing is grounded in the fact that they are the custodians of the 2 holy shrines. The official title of the king is the custodian of the 2 holy shrines, the shrine in Mecca and the shrine in Medina. And they lost this custody for 2 weeks. This was very embarrassing for them. At the time, there were calls around the Muslim world to put Mecca and Medina under international control because the Saudi government had proved itself to be so unable and capable of controlling them. And so all information about this is under very tight lid in Saudi Arabia. There was a book of official documents published in the kingdom, official speeches about this, a year after the siege. Then it was withdrawn and pulped and has been banned. And so as I went to Saudi Arabia a couple of times, I really tried to track down the people who could tell me about this. And I had been there before as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. So I started out by going to all the Islamic activists that I knew, sort of asking them, do you know anybody who was in the Grand Mosque? And eventually, one by one, I managed to track down quite a few of the former rebels or their sympathizers. The problem, of course, that all the adult men who were in the mosque on the rebel side were executed, either beheaded in public or killed in secret in the following month. So the only eyewitnesses from among the people who were inside the mosque are men who at the time were 15 or 16 or 14 years of age, They've spent many years in prison, but are still alive. So some of them were absolutely scared of talking to me. Some of them, it was sort of quite a funny incident with one of them, because I called one of these men, getting his number through a whole network of Islamic activists, saying, you know, I want to talk to you about the battle for Mecca. And I said, yes, come along. So I came to his house. You know, this very sort of man with a big beard is sitting with all his friends. And it turns out, and I told him, you know, here's a picture of you in the Grand Mosque. There was a picture of him as a young man there. And blood drained from his face, because it turns out that he is now an Islamic scholar working for the government. And he had written a book about the Battle of Mecca in the 7th century involving Prophet Muhammad, and he thought I want to talk to him about his book. So once he realized what's going on, he started shaking and sort of expelled us from his household. But I had more luck with other people, and one of the young Saudis, one of the Saudis who was young at the time of the Grand Mosque, and whose 2 brothers had been executed for participating in the attacks, spent the whole night in my hotel room because he was too afraid to be seen with me in public in the lobby, emptying out the non-alcoholic contents of my minibar as he recounted sort of hour by hour what had happened to him to this horrendous siege. And I was really lucky also because the US government usually takes a long time in declassifying documents from its archives. But in this time, I've been just in time, both much of the traffic of the American embassy in Saudi Arabia, and also the personal diaries of John West, who was the American ambassador at the time in Riyadh. All this has been declassified, and if any of you are interested, many of these documents are actually posted on the website of the book. I guess I'm ready to take questions now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Yaroslav. That was one of the paradoxical things about the Grand Mosque is that on the one hand, it's the, as you know, it's the, the center of Islamic worship. It's this place which might seem very exotic because non-Muslims are not allowed to go to it, etc., etc. On the other hand, if you go there, you realize that this is a place which is full of American products and institutions. It's surrounded by Hiltons and Sheratons. The perimeter of the mosque is full of fast food restaurants, Burger King, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken. In a sense, for many Muslims from around the world who go to Mecca, it's the first experience of America, all right? It's like you go there, your first Big Mac in Mecca, right? It's also a great mart for the selling of goods of all kinds, which it has always been. But today these goods are, and I've met relatives who go on pilgrimage to Mecca and they come back and I said, what did you get? And they say, I got, a hi-fi system, a stereo system, etc. So the curious thing, the paradox about this, as you know, is that it's on the one hand, it's all this, and on the other hand, it's America. But the question I want to ask you as well is that, as you know, the Wahhabi doctrine that is followed by the Saudi government is one that is extremely contemptuous of sacred spaces. So that the Saudis of all, they're not in the whole history of Islam has any group done so much damage to Mecca as the Saudis themselves have. They've destroyed the house of the Prophet Muhammad. They've destroyed tombs of revered and holy persons. They've tried to clear people out because they think that any adoration of any object is a form of idolatry. So again, you have this curious situation. They want to defend this sacred and holy space, which is like America, and they also want to destroy it. How do you, how did this attitude sort of inform the attack?
Well, I don't think there were many McDonald's outlets in Mecca at that time. But it's true that the actual Grand Mosque, everything apart from the Kaaba and a few other little corners, was new. It was built in the 1950s by the Bin Laden company to accommodate the growing traffic of pilgrims. With the air travel becoming cheaper and cheaper, the number of visitors grew exponentially. And but of course, the Saudi disrespect for actual material antiquities is well known. They bulldozed pretty much all of ancient Mecca, and this was one of the reasons why they actually did go into the Grand Mosque with tanks and artillery, armored personnel carriers, and destroyed much of the structure. Absolutely.
The other thing that it suddenly came as a kind of, speaking in religious terms, as a revelation to me when I read your book, is that it had, before reading your book, I thought to myself that perhaps the Rushdie affair was the first sign of sort of global Islamic consciousness. It was the first global Islamic event in the sense that it brought together people from across the Muslim world who didn't know each other, who didn't share the same beliefs, practices, languages, and brought them together in defense of the image of the Prophet, which was apparently attacked by a book which most of them, as we know, had not read. But after reading this, I realized that in fact, this must be, if we are going to posit an origin. And what's interesting about this origin is that, again, all kinds of things are brought together in a structural rather than genealogical way, so that, what you didn't talk about today, but which your book deals with, the uprising among the Shiites in Saudi Arabia, who seem to have thought that Juhayman was somehow connected to them, which he wasn't. These Pakistanis who didn't really know what Juhayman was all about, but they went and attacked the US embassy, others in other countries. So you have a kind of concatenation of events which are not really tied together in any genealogical, you can't, do a linear thing. So in that sense, it is the first global movement. I mean, how would you?
Well, I think if you look at the origins of Al Qaeda and the structure of Al Qaeda today, it's really ideologically a fusion of two traditions: the Saudi Wahhabi zeal, if you will, and the very good organizational and militant skills of the Egyptian jihadists. The offshoots from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And these two currents that are fundamental to the global terrorist movement now, really for the first time came together in Mecca, because Juhayman was a Saudi and he brought with him many, many Saudi militants, but a great many Egyptians also took part in it. And the books by Juhayman had written a book of epistles sort of outlining his message that was published secretly in Kuwait a year before the attacks. And this was very widely circulated in Egypt. And one of the men who read it and who went to Mecca to take part in the attacks was this preacher named Muhammad Ilyas, who was really a leading figure in the Gamada Islamiyya community. He was one of the teachers who taught Islam to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 of Al Qaeda. So this was really the first moment of fusion of these two traditions. And of course, the Saudi government was lucky that this was the time before the internet, before mobile phones, before satellite television. And so they were able to contain Juhayman's message. They were able to really control the spread of the uprising, something that they would not be able to do now. And I had a very interesting conversation with a former Saudi officer who is the man who actually arrested Juhayman in the basement of the Grand Mosque. And he was telling me that if it had happened today, with all the information that spread that you cannot control, they would have probably won.
Yeah, in a way, you can see how it is that mass media and unstoppable access makes Osama and company what they are. But the thing that really interests me again about your book is the subterranean line of influence and effect, which is yet not a genealogy because it's a structural thing.
Yeah.
But the question that I had then is, I completely accept your argument that there is a connection, a structural connection. But what strikes me as odd is that what appears to be very important in the Juhayman uprising, the messianic apocalyptic thing, does not seem to be inherited. So that even though from the in the 19th century and earlier, jihad movements had routinely claimed to be apocalyptic and produce messiah-like figures, you don't have that today. You don't have that with Al Qaeda. In fact, with Osama, he seems to be more concerned with global warming and the end of the world than with any kind of messianic or apocalyptic vision.
Well, I mean, the messianic proclamation of Juhayman was proven to be wrong because the Mahdi is not supposed to be, a Mahdi is supposed to be immortal. Mahdi cannot be killed by mere mortals. So once the man who was put forward as the Mahdi was killed and his body was shown on Saudi television, and there is a very graphic picture of him, of his cadaver in the book, that was really the end of the belief in the Mahdi. And so that part of, Juhayman was proven to be wrong. The Mahdi had not come. So that part of the ideology did not migrate further, did not go to the new generation of jihadis. But much of his opposition to the ideological and religious opposition to the presence of Westerners in Saudi Arabia, to the legitimacy of Al Saud's rule, that really is repeated almost word by word in later writings by people like bin Laden.
No, it is an extraordinary thing. I mean, it strikes me that perhaps, do you think it's possible to say that, in a way, the exclusion of the messianic and apocalyptic vision from subsequent jihad movements has something to do with not only the failure of Juhayman, but also with, in a way, the exclusion of Christianity and Judaism, because the apocalyptic and messianic tone and language is more characteristic of Christian and Jewish movements, and has been, and that's where Islam gets it from anyway, right? The idea of a Messiah and all the rest.
Well, Muslim will tell you it's from Prophet Muhammad.
But insofar as they accept Jesus as the Messiah, for instance.
Yes,
right?
actually, in the ideology of Juhayman, I mean, the Mahdi was supposed to be only the first step towards the return of Jesus, who, in his vision, would be then the one slaughtering all the infidels with his sweet breath. Infidels would be the Christians, of course. And it's interesting that when the Saudi clerics had to debate this whole issue, they took it very seriously. Sheikh Nasser al-Rashid, who was the custodian of the holy shrines on the religious establishment side, had this long argument saying, well, he's probably not the right Messiah because in the Hadith it says that Jesus will come in the city of Damascus and will hide in its walls, but there are no walls surrounding Damascus right now. And then he will fight 70,000 Jews from Isfahan, and well, right now there are not 70,000 Jews who live in Isfahan. So probably he's not quite correct on the Messiah front. But I think the tradition of the Messiah, of the Mahdi, is quite strong. I mean, both in Shia and Sunni Islam, and is invoked quite often. In Sudan in the 19th century, the British were defeated in Khartoum by another Mahdi, who was also Muhammad, son of Abdullah, who claimed the same signs.
No, yes, I was saying there's a whole series of such movements, and the puzzling thing is after Juhayman, you don't really have them appearing again. But the other thing that also concerned me, which relates to your answer just now, was that do you think it's possible to see, because as far as I know, and I don't know, I'm not a student of Wahhabism, so I only know what I read. This whole kind of apocalyptic, Mahdic language has not traditionally been so important to it. Is it possible to see the invocation of this language by Juhayman and his compatriots as being somehow as much a sign of the dissolution and fragmentation of Wahhabism and of traditional Islamism as it is of anything else? In other words, could this allow us to see what marks off, say, modern jihad movements from old-fashioned Islam?
I mean, these were the birth pangs of the modern jihad movement, and this was a very special time, turn of the century, which is always when messianic ideas take hold. So the time was right. It was a very easy message to sell, and having spoken to some of the members of that movement who are not Saudis, a lot of them didn't quite believe the idea of the Mahdi, but they went along with the plan anyway, just because they saw the strength of the organization, the strength of the weaponry that Juhayman's men had amassed, and figured that this would, in any case, be the spark that would set off a global Islamic revolution and sort of transform the world.
I think that before I open it up to questions from the audience, I just want to say that in our own millennium, the changing of our own century, the only messianic figure we had was the millennium bug, sadly, or perhaps maybe we should be grateful for that.
Yes.
But anyway, thank you very much. Questions from the audience?
May I go ahead? Yeah, I have two questions. One is technical. Did many of the rebels survive the gas attack and were caught and executed, as opposed to being all dead? And the movie theater in Moscow, a good third of the group of 600 hostages and rebels died. The second question is, what was happening during the attack or during the takeover outside in terms of flying attempts at outreach? I know that the media was shut down by the government, but in terms of distributing paper and trying to put the word out, was there another team that was trying to make the revolution happen, to overthrow the government? Thank you.
Thank you. Great questions. Nobody knows exactly how many people died in the Grand Mosque. The Saudi government came up with conflicting numbers. For example, Prince Naif first said, gave out a number for the casualties among the civilians and the soldiers. Then a few weeks later, he gave another number for the casualties among the soldiers, which was twice as large, but never updated the number for the civilians. obviously, a large number of the rebels survived this gassing. I mean, 63, if I believe correctly, were executed in public. Many were killed, but nobody knows the correct breakdown, just because the information has been so tightly controlled. Foreign diplomats estimate that all in all, more than 1,000 people died on all sides in that attack. As for what was happening in the rest of the kingdom, a separate uprising broke out at the time in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, which is where pretty much all of the kingdom's oil is located, and also is the place where the majority of the population is Shiite. So the Shiites in Saudi Arabia had no idea about who Juhayman was, and Juhayman himself was violently anti-Shiite. He believed that the Shiites should be killed or converted. One of his chief grievances with the royal family of Saudi Arabia was that they are too soft on the Shiites. Nevertheless, rioting spread out in the cities of the eastern province. Violent clashes began with the Saudi National Guard, and the Saudi government had to reroute some of the troops that it had in Mecca and send them to the east, to the eastern province to fight the Shiites. And the National Guard troopers were much more eager to fight against the Shiites than against fellow Bedouins who were in the Grand Mosque. But of course, the Shiites in the eastern province didn't quite have the martial skills that Juhayman's rebels possessed, so their uprising was crushed fairly rapidly.
Hi, Yalman Onaran from Bloomberg News. Although I'm not here as a reporter, really, I'm just interested in the book. But of course, it's easy to pin down events in history as the start of things. But one thing I noticed when you were talking about how the ulama, when they were trying to make their decision about this, they actually extracted some reversals of policy from the Saudi government, part of it being a lot of money funneled to Islamic education, and then the invasion of Afghanistan happened. And my reading, and I'm not a student of this stuff that much, but all the stuff that I have read, because especially after the invasion of Afghanistan, the US government, CIA, and other operatives of the US government around the world strongly supported the Islamic education in Muslim countries, and these events all seem to be connected to that, i.e. invasion of Afghanistan, what happened in Saudi Arabia, all brought out a flood of financial support into Islamic education. Do you think perhaps that is just as a strong reason why we saw the Islamic jihadist movements around the world? Because when you have thousands of millions of dollars being spent on educating Muslims in Islamic education, then you get people who are jihadists. I don't know. What do you say?
Well, I don't think Islamic education as such is a problem. The question is what kind of education. And obviously this Wahhabi indoctrination, the spreading of this very fundamentalist, radical viewpoint to countries that traditionally had much more liberal interpretations of Islam has fueled the rise of radicalism. And of course, the US reaction to what happened in Mecca, with the benefit of 2020 hindsight vision, is really tragic, because there was no understanding whatsoever that this represented the beginning of a new threat. Even hawks in the administration, like Zbigniew Brzezinski, they would write in memos to the president that we should not be afraid of the Islamic wave. This is not the wave of the future. And there was a CIA report called the Mecca Incident in Perspective. And so the perspective of the CIA was that this is just a one-off throwback to the Bedouin grievances of the past. And the Saudi public is strongly behind Al Saud, and there is no threat whatsoever in the future from the Islamic opposition to the regime. So this lack of, the West basically blinked at the time and missed the birth of this formidable new enemy because it was focused so much on Iran. And looking at the current events, we're sort of at the risk of repeating the same mistake, because now with the attention being so much zeroed in on Iran, suddenly everybody has forgotten about Saudi Arabia. Last year when Hezbollah was fighting against Israel in Lebanon, a bunch of Saudi clerics issued fatwas against Hezbollah, and everybody in Washington or the West applauded them, forgetting that this very same clerics had issued fatwas supporting bin Laden, and the only reason they were against Hezbollah is because they are infidel Shiites.
I've got two questions. You partly answered them. I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about the blame that the Iranians blamed the Americans. That first, what was it, 24 hours, 48 hours? You just touched on that. If you could explain that in a little bit more detail. It's a little confusing to me to understand why the hostage takers in Iran grabbed this, how they got it, and why they blamed us. And the second one was there anything to indicate that when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, did it have any relationship to their understanding of what had happened in Mecca?
Well, the dynamic of the events was this. The rebels invaded the shrine. 24 hours later, a spokesman for the State Department breaks the news. American officials tell American newspapers it's probably the work of the Iranians. It's at night in Washington, everybody in Iran is asleep. In the morning in Tehran, a few hours later, Ayatollah Khomeini, or at least his aides, read all these telegrams from Washington and immediately issue their statement saying, we have nothing to do with this. This is an American Zionist conspiracy against Islam. And unlike the State Department, they are believed across the Muslim world, much to the surprise of American officials, because up until then, the understanding was that America had a problem with Iran. Just Iran. This was an Iranian nationalist issue. Suddenly, there was this realization that America had a problem with pretty much the entire Muslim world. And it was a big shock to the administration. And in fact, the first response was to pull out much of the American diplomatic presence everywhere in the Muslim world. Much to the dismay of many officials at the National Security Council. One of them wrote a memo saying, sort of running under fire will only encourage future generations of jihadists, which it probably did. Now, what was your second question?
The question had to do with the decision in the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan. Do you have any idea whether or not they were influenced in that decision by what had happened in Mecca?
Yeah. I think it would be a stretch to say that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan because of Mecca, but it certainly was a contributing factor. Because what happened is that in reaction to the Mecca uprising, the U.S. administration immediately dispatched another aircraft carrier group to the Gulf. When the Soviet defense minister saw this, he was shocked and said, well, if the Americans can send the forces all the way up to our borders, well, we surely can invade the neighboring country. And they were encouraged by two factors. At the time, the U.S. government was not yet supporting militarily the rebels in Afghanistan, the rebels who were fighting the communist regime that was already in place there. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan were funding them. CIA only started providing non-lethal aid in July of that year. And suddenly, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, the two main backers of the Islamist forces, the rebels in Afghanistan, seemed to be on the brink of collapse. The Saudi government was fighting on two fronts. The Pakistani government wasn't able to protect the American embassy in its capital. So certainly this was an element of encouragement for the Soviet decision.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Madeline. I'm actually a student of Islamic Studies at Columbia, writing my thesis on this event. So I'm very happy that your book came out at this time. I have a few questions for you. One, you kind of posited this as the point from which the global jihadist movement arose. Do you think this is also a significant point in the formation of sort of politicized sectarian identities in the Middle East? I mean, of course, the Shia outbreak in Al-Issa in the eastern province comes right after this, and it's right on the heels of the Iranian Revolution. So if you could talk a little bit about the development of that in light of all of our sectarian focus on Shias versus Sunnis in the Middle East today. And the second question is, aside from the sort of religious, messianic aspect of this, being the year 1400 and the coming of Messiah, how much do you think the Iranian Revolution impacted Juhayman's decision to hold this uprising at this particular time?
Well, I will start with answering your second question, because I was actually very much interested in how much of influence the Iranians had. And I asked many people who were in Juhayman's movement about this. And the answer was that Juhayman did not watch television. He rarely read newspapers. And for him, the Shiites were, heretics and apostates. And therefore, he had very little currency for the Iranian regime. This was really dictated by the calendar of Islam, the first day of the new century. And so while it was happening at the same time, he personally and many of his followers, at least the Saudi ones, were not really that much influenced by the Iranian Revolution. I'm sure many of the foreigners were, but not the Saudis. Now, coming to the Shiites in the Eastern Province, this was really the very first time in Saudi history, in the history of the Saudi kingdom, that the Shiites rose up. This was the very first, I mean, they were encouraged by Juhayman's uprising in Mecca. They rose up, people were killed, cities in the Eastern Province were in fire. And this is when the Saudi government realized that they have a very big problem with the Shiites. And part of the answer by the Saudi government was really to sort of encourage the sectarianism and the propaganda against the Shiites, trying to turn the rest of the population against them, to portray them as the enemies of the state, and etc.
But also kind of to appease them economically.
Yes, but they have tried to appease them economically, though violence continued for years and years after that. There were new outbreaks of violence there. But one of the outcomes of the uprising in Mecca was that the religious establishment gained much greater power, and gained much greater power in propagating their view of the Shiites as the others, as the enemies, around the world, not just in Saudi Arabia, because part of this Wahhabi indoctrination around the world was also indoctrination against the Shiites.
Yes, Barbara Pearl. I'm wondering if you can say what the current knowledge and opinion of the Siege of Mecca is throughout the Muslim world today.
Mm-hmm. Very little is known. The Saudi government has done a very good job in concealing information about this. And as I was reporting the book in Saudi Arabia, I had lots of very eager helpers, because there were people who are 20, 25 years of age who really wanted to learn about what happened, because they knew nothing about it. And this book is supposed to come out in Arabic as well, which is just a sign of how much this is news to the Arabs and to people in the broader Muslim world.
Well, they don't still think America.
Well, I don't think people think America did it. No, I think once the rebels came out of the mosque, once they were shown on television, people realized it's not an American Zionist conspiracy. But beyond that, very few people knew what happened. I mean, the whole role of the French, for example, was very little known. The fact that Americans were taking part in this was not known to the general public either.
Ian Cuthbertson from the World Policy Institute. Could you speak a little more about the dichotomy between the response in the Muslim world to the attack and in the United States? The fact that the Iranian statement set off a wave of attacks against American embassies and institutions, and yet after the attack was over, the American government decided it was a one-off thing that didn't have any wider ramifications. You've had access to the documents. Why was there no connection made between these two events? What did the Americans think the catalyst was for the attacks on the embassies, other than believing the Iranians were behind it, or did they just simply believe the Iranians were behind it?
Well, they did believe that the Iranians were behind it. And in fact, it's the Iranian propaganda that led people to believe this was an American Zionist sort of, conspiracy, as Khomeini phrased it. But I think what happened in the following weeks with the war in Afghanistan turned the attention to the other infidels in the region, to the Russians. And the people watched and really thought they could exploit this by channeling all this anger to a different enemy, who was now a more obvious enemy. And so the belief was that this little flurry of attacks that happened in these 2 weeks was really an exception, and now would redirect all this anger towards the Russians, which sort of happened in the following years.
So there was no deeper analysis of why there was such a resonance to the Iranian claims?
There was a lot of blame of the Soviets, lots of anguish. One of the memos said, how come it's the Soviets who oppress the Muslims, it's the Soviets in their own country, it's the Soviets who are supporting the communist government of Afghanistan, but it's us who get blamed. There was a lot of kind of lack of understanding, but there were no answers provided.
Thank you.
My name is Ann Phillips. I'm on the board of the World Policy Institute. Forgive me if what I'm asking is something that you've touched on, but I've had difficulty catching everything that you said. The acoustics, for me at least, have been difficult. You can't emphasize enough the enormous enmity on the part of the Shiites towards the Sunni I mean, the Shiites have been really persecuted and hated and reviled for these centuries. And if the Iranians knew, and obviously they did, what was happening, what happened in Mecca, why wouldn't they let the world know about it in a way to belittle the Sunnis and what the Sunnis had done in Mecca? Actually, the rebels defiled the mosque as well as the Saudis. Sure. So this was an opportunity for these Shiites really to belittle them and to send out the word about the Sunni behavior. Why was that not done, do you suppose?
Yeah. Well, there are two answers to this. The first one is that the Iranians, for the first day and a half, didn't know what was going on in Mecca.
They did not know.
No. They were just as much at loss of who are these rebels as the Americans were. But there is a bigger reason. I mean, Iranians at the time and now don't just claim to be the leaders of the Shiite world. They claim to be the leaders of the Muslim world. So they very much downplay the difference between Sunni and Shia. And in fact, when the demonstrations broke out in the eastern province by the Shiites of Saudi Arabia, they were chanting the slogan that was repeated by Khomeini before: La Shia, La Sunniya, Tharwa, Tharwa Islamiyya. No Shia, no Sunni, Islamic Revolution, Islamic Revolution. So Iranians, being a minority group within Islam, always tried to position themselves not as the Shiites, but as spokespeople for the entire Muslim nation.
Well, then I'm sorry, then I misunderstood, because when you said that they had called it an American Zionist plot, I thought you were referring to the uprising in Mecca.
Yes, but
so they did know about it.
Well, they knew that something had happened in Mecca. They didn't know who was behind. They didn't know who was Juhayman. They didn't know what the rebels wanted, and it was very easy for them to deflect the American accusations of Iranian involvement, but pointing the finger back at America.
I see. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I look forward very much to reading your book.
Thank you.
I had a quick question about the Saudi response to the uprising. And in speaking with people today or during the course of your research in Saudi Arabia, did you find that they have any regrets about how they dealt with it and how they chose not to sort of de-Wahhabify their own kingdom in the ensuing decade or two that have followed, that have enabled Al Qaeda's chickens to come home to roost, partly in Saudi Arabia? And if there's any sort of movement on that, any hope that they might become more progressive?
There is certainly an element of this, and it's even within the royal family. The governor of the province of Asir, the home of many of the 9/11 hijackers, who is the son of former King Faisal and is the brother of the current Saudi foreign minister, he said a few years ago that the mistake we've made is that we've killed Juhayman, the leader of the uprising, but we really let his ideology spread throughout the kingdom, pretending it doesn't exist. So there is this element of regrets, and quite a few of the followers of Juhayman that I've met and who are still alive today in Saudi Arabia have changed their stripes. Some of them are very sort of secularist activists. There is quite a number of former radicals who have seen the light and really went to the other side.
And just to follow up to that, do you think that that has any impact, or does it play out in Saudi Arabia's policy to promote Wahhabism outside of Saudi Arabia, particularly through their use of madrasas that are quite retrogressive?
You know, after September the 11th, the Saudi government realized that they do have a problem, and it did backfire on them. So some elements within the royal family did try to control and to contain this activity. But the religious establishment is very strong. It's a separate pillar of power. So there are limits to how much the government can actually, or elements within the government can actually enforce this control. So yes, there are attempts to do it, but are they efficient? I'm not so sure.
Humphrey Taylor. I think I heard you say, and I also had some trouble hearing, actually, but I think I heard you say that your book will be published in Arabic?
Yes.
In which countries do you think it will not be publicly available?
What do you think? Saudi Arabia would be the first on my guest list. Well, I think it's going to be very controversial throughout the Persian Gulf area. But in Egypt, for example, Juhayman's writings are widely available. They are sold in bookstores and actually, gone through 3 editions. So outside of Saudi Arabia, there is quite a lot of open debate about this, but very little information until now.
Hi, Yaroslav. Good to see you and congratulations.
Thank you.
Perhaps you already said that in your presentation, and sorry for being late 10 minutes. What was the main reason for you to choose this subject for your second book? Thank you.
Well, when I would go to Saudi Arabia or talk to people who are studying Saudi Arabia, a lot of them would point to this moment as really the crucial turning point, the birth of the jihadi movement. And yet, very few people could tell me what actually happened there. There were all sorts of wild rumors and theories and disinformation floating around. And there's nothing really authoritative that details this whole story. And so I felt that it would be an interesting subject to look into, to try to tell the story of what happened, because it's an event that is much talked about, but few people know what actually happened there.
Well, it's true. In fact, many people didn't know that.
Well, now you do.
Well, thank you very much, Yaroslav. And I just want you all to join with me in thanking Yaroslav Trofimov for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I also want to say that the book is available for sale at the back, and I think you'll be doing signings.
Yes, I will.
So you have that prospect before you.
Great. Thank you all again. Thanks again to the Committee on Historical Studies and the South Asia Forum. Books are at the back of the room. Again, I urge you to check out the website of the book, www.
Yaroslav Trofimov is a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and the author of Faith at War, A Journey on the Frontlines of Islam. For more on his newest book, The Siege of Mecca, visit doubleday.com/Siege of Mecca.